Hi, everyone. Welcome back. Welcome to season 3 of Humane Voices. I'm so glad that you're here. We're here for another season. We have a great lineup of people for you. We have some great topics and everything. The first one being is today. We're going to talk about the food industry scorecard. What does that mean? The Humane Society of the United States surveyed 100 major food companies on how they're progressing in animal welfare issues. Are they keeping their promises? What does the scorecard mean? You've basically seen it. You've been to school, right? You get a report card A through F. You're doing well. You're keeping up your progress. You get an A. If you're not doing so hot, you'll go down the line. And that's really what we're talking about here in a nutshell. But you'll have to get more information on our guest for today. You really should take a look at this scorecard if you haven't seen it before. It's easy. You can throw it up on your fridge. It's a really good one-pager. And even if you click the individual links of the companies themselves, they'll tell you more information about it. Where can you find it? humanesociety.org/scorecard. Again, that's humanesociety.org/scorecard. All right. Let's get right into the episode coming up. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Humane Voices. Carrie and Austin here for another episode. We're here today talking about the food industry scorecard. So the question is, are major food companies really keeping their animal welfare promises? That's really what we're here to talk about today. Carrie, how are you doing?
I'm holding up. The best one can ask these days, right?
I know. Yeah, with everything going on, we're just staying afloat, right?
Yeah, totally. I think that this is it's such an interesting topic to talk about right now. Not only because it's so critical to some of the work that we do, but also just because I think we're living in a moment where we're seeing examples in other areas of places where companies are trying to make sort of attempts at social statements or saying, hey, we're doing something good on behalf of our community, on behalf of the environment, on behalf of another issue. And it's really interesting to explore the accountability factor here. I mean, this is, Matt, I hope you can tell us a little bit more about sort of the history of this project and, what exactly the food scorecard is and why we produced it.
Yeah, well, let's bring him on now. Today, our special guest for the show is Matt Prescott. Matt Prescott is the Senior Director of the Food and Agriculture here at the Humane Society of the United States. Matt, thank you so much for sitting down and chatting with us today. We're really, really glad that we're here and we can talk about such an interesting topic.
Thanks so much for having me on. It's great to be here. And I'm in Austin, and your name is Austin, so I'm going to try to not get super confused.
That's actually why we had this episode today, right when you were in Austin. That's why we had it.
So. Well, I live here, so it worked out well.
Perfect.
Austin also lives in Austin, which is why he was late to our podcast, because he's such a diva, because he's just always living in Austin.
My hair, needed to be coiffed. The humidity's really bad over there, so right. Yeah, it's fine. No, but yeah, Matt, I would love to, Carrie and I have been really excited to talk to you about this because, like Carrie said, it's a very, very interesting look, almost like a checks and balances against a lot of the major food companies that we're dealing with on an everyday basis. So can you, before we get into the really fascinating report, can you tell us what the food industry scorecard is and how it came about?
Yeah, the food industry scorecard is an initiative that the Humane Society of the United States created in 2019 and launched publicly earlier this year. And it's basically a corporate accountability tool. We have been working with the world's largest food companies for well over a decade, helping them make various promises to change their supply chains to better account for animal welfare, to treat animals better when it comes to the meat and the eggs that they're selling or serving their customers. And we want to find out how are companies doing in terms of actually keeping those promises. It's one thing to say you're going to make an improvement in your supply chain, and it's another thing to actually make that improvement. And so we conducted a survey of about 100 of the world's largest food companies, asking them a series of questions designed to get to the heart of that matter, asking them what policies they've made over the years on specific issues, and then to report their progress on keeping those policies.
So if you had to sort of qualify and say, before we get into sort of the nitty gritty, like what's the overall picture look like?
It's such a mixed bag. There are a lot of companies that are doing the right thing, that are making really good progress toward their goals. Unilever is one example. They got an A+ on the scorecard. And just as one example, Unilever had a policy to switch to 100% cage-free eggs in their supply chain. Not only did they keep the promise, but they implemented it like 3 years ahead of schedule, earlier than they said they were going to do it. They got it done.
Great.
On the other side of the spectrum, there are on the far other side of the spectrum, there are companies that have never had any meaningful animal welfare promises whatsoever. Companies like Domino's Pizza and Waffle House and a few others that are just kind of bottom of the barrel when it comes to animal welfare. And then there's a whole lot of companies in between. Companies that have made some really good promises and are maybe making some progress toward keeping them, but still have a ways to go.
So in terms of how you grade these folks, like do the Fs go to the people who've never even bothered to try to make a commitment, and the in-betweens are the people who are saying, oh, we're going to do it, but maybe they're not there yet? Or how'd you figure out how to score it?
Well, we tried to be very objective and very fair and very scientific in the scoring. We didn't want it to be based on just our opinions of a company or any kind of view that we might have of the company from having worked with them over the years. We want it to be based on data. And so what we did was we created 20 questions that asked the companies a series of questions. So just for example, do you have a policy to switch to 100% cage-free eggs? Do you have a policy to eliminate gestation crates from your supply chain? And depending on the answer, they got a set number of points. If you answered no, that you never even had those policies, you got like -10 points. If you answered yes, you got +10 points. We also asked questions about progress. So, okay, you have a policy to switch to cage-free eggs. What percentage of your eggs today are cage-free? You could, as a company answering it, filling out the survey, you could select 0%, 1 to 10% cage-free eggs, 11 to 20%, and so on. And for each of those different answers, you were awarded a different number of points. At the end of the process, we tallied up the points and then assigned every company a number value and then a corresponding grade. So the whole thing was very objective. And to be honest, there were some companies that like we have really good relationships with that I would say before having done this, we might have said, yeah, that company is like really good on animal welfare. They've made some good promises. They're good to work with. That did worse than we thought. And there were companies that did better than we thought they would.
And you originally mentioned Unilever. I know that we can talk about a few of these companies. So who is Unilever? I just want the audience to understand kind of the impact that some of these companies have on our daily lives. So what does Unilever usually work with at the consumer base?
Yeah, so people hear a company name like Unilever and they might think, oh yeah, that sounds vaguely familiar. Unilever is one of those companies that is, I don't know if this is the term they would use, but I would call them like a multinational conglomerate of brands, where people might not know Unilever, but they certainly would know Hellmann's mayonnaise. Mm-hmm. They certainly would know Ben & Jerry's ice cream, just to name a few. These are the types of brands that companies like Unilever offer to the public. They're called consumer packaged goods companies. Another example would be Kraft Heinz. They have Oscar Mayer. They have obviously Heinz ketchup and all the Heinz products. Just innumerable consumer-facing brands that are everyday products that people buy, all across the world.
In a previous episodes, Matt, we talked about labeling in the grocery stores specifically, and I think a big issue is that there is no uniformity when it comes to identifying the foods that you eat. What is cage-free? What is pasture-raised? What is grass-fed? What are all these different things? And I think that the scorecard really has a great way of, hey, let me check against what this company is doing, seeing how they're being kept accountable, and then I can make an informed choice when I'm heading to the grocery store. And we all know that the consumer has a lot of buying power when it comes to all these things in this type of market. So I that was my biggest takeaway that I really, really enjoyed when I was looking through this scorecard. So
yeah, and what we tried to do with the scorecard was not just limit it to any one issue. And so within the scorecard, the questions centered around animal welfare, obviously, issues like cage confinement of egg-laying hens. Many people may know that the vast majority of egg-laying hens in this country are locked in tiny cages so small they can't even turn around. They can't even spread their wings. Mother pigs in the pork industry are kept in tiny gestation crates so small they can't turn around. They can maybe take a step forward or backwards for their entire lives. That's all they're given. It's a meager amount of space. But then we also ask questions, we ask questions about how companies are doing and moving away from those like worst of the worst practices on factory farms. But then we also ask questions about, for example, companies' attention to the growing movement around plant-based foods. And if they have programs and initiatives to serve or sell more plant-based products to their customers. Plant-based products obviously don't have any animal welfare problems attached to them because they're made out of plants, not animals. And so then in the scorecard, we didn't just provide a ranking of like A through F, not just the report card, but we provided individual analyses of every company. So somebody who really wants to make sure they're supporting a company that is, cage-free can go and look at the analysis and find that. Somebody who really wants to support a company that's going all out on plant-based products can go look in the scorecard and figure out what companies are moving on that. And so it's rather than just kind of recommending to people support this company or don't support this company, it's we just provide a full view and then let people make up their own minds about the companies they want to support.
Thanks, Matt. One of the things I wanted to ask you about, so when you're looking at the rankings of the various companies, like what does it take for a company to get that A+? And does that mean that there's nothing that they can improve? Have they reached the sort of pinnacle of what they can do on the animal welfare front, or is there still more?
That is a great question. Unfortunately for the animals, there's always more that a company can do. Animals on factory farms suffer and face innumerable cruelties on a daily basis. Even on what we would consider to be, well-run farms with decent standards, there are still problems. Even cage-free, for example, people hear about cage-free eggs. That's a huge campaign of ours to get chickens out of cages. But cage-free does not mean cruelty-free. Even cage-free chickens are packed by the tens of thousands into warehouses where they, probably never get fresh air or see sunlight. It's not old McDonald's farm, even on cage-free facilities. What our scorecard measured against was not a gold standard of animal welfare, but basically minimum standards to have any degree of even okay animal welfare.
Right.
Because that's how pitiful our nation's food supply is that's the standard we have to measure against. It's not old McDonald's farm, but basically somewhat decent factory farms.
Yeah, that's really so. With something like a grocery store that's received like a really high mark, I mean, what does that exactly cover? Like, I'm thinking specifically of Whole Foods, which I think did very well in the survey. But when I'm thinking, as a regular hipster shopper of Whole Foods myself, like if I'm going into Whole Foods, does that mean I can feel more confident about everything I purchase there, or do I need to get more granular as a consumer when I'm buying things from Whole Foods?
Well, I guess without speaking to any one company, because they're all so different, I would say that, people who are interested in animal welfare, people who are interested in the move toward plant-based proteins should look through the scorecard and read the analyses of every company and see, how each company stacks up on the issues that they care about. I would say, generally speaking, companies that did better on the scorecard are, frankly, just doing better on these issues across the board. A company that scored an A+ or a company that scored an A or a B+ is generally doing better than a company that scored an F, as you might not be surprised to learn.
Yeah.
So another point that stuck out, a flip side of the coin that of companies that are doing really, really well are companies that have made a great first impression, but might have been slipping on that commitment to keeping their promise towards animal welfare. Are you seeing that with some of the companies, and are there some that have stuck out as examples to you?
Yeah, it's there's a little bit of backstory here on that notion between of the space between making a promise and keeping a promise. Anybody who's ever made a promise knows it's can be somewhat easy to make a promise. It's actually keeping the promise that can be the tricky part. If somebody tells you something in confidence and they say, "Look, you got to promise never to tell anybody this," it's fine to say, "Yeah, oh yeah, totally. I'll keep it totally secret." Then actually keeping the secret is the other story. I like to think that I do okay with that, but but it can be hard sometimes, and companies are no different. And so, going back before the scorecard, way before the scorecard, in the late 90s, there was an incident in the United Kingdom where a group of environmental activists started campaigning against and targeting McDonald's over deforestation. The issue at hand is that the rainforests were and are being deforested to make room for cattle grazing and farm animal feed production. And a group of environmental activists said, hey, we're going to target McDonald's over this. McDonald's sued them, saying, we don't own feedlots. We're not deforesting the rainforest. You can't tell consumers that we're responsible for this because we're not doing it. We're just a fast food chain. And a judge in the UK ruled that McDonald's could be held responsible for deforestation, and that the things that these activists were saying had validity.
Yeah.
And at
billions and billions sold.
Yeah.
Exactly. And so at that point, environmental organizations and animal welfare organizations and many others said, yeah, you know what, we should be holding retailers and fast food chains accountable for what happens in their supply chain. And so in the ensuing years, myself and colleagues at the Humane Society and other organizations started reaching out to companies that sell eggs and meat and saying, hey, you got to demand better treatment for animals in your supply chain. It's your responsibility as a fast food chain or a grocery chain to make sure that animals at least aren't suffering like the worst of the worst abuses. And a lot of companies made promises to do better. They said within 10 years, we're going to get rid of cages for egg laying hens, or we're going to get mother pigs out of crates. But there's a divide between making that promise and keeping that promise. And so what we found is that a lot of companies have made a lot of really good promises to create better conditions for animals in their supply chains. Many companies are making good strides toward keeping those promises. They seem to be, working in earnest to do the right thing. Other companies have hit more roadblocks, or it's been more of a mixed bag. Take a company like Aramark, for example. Many people may not have heard of Aramark, but they're a big food service company. They operate cafeterias like in universities and corporate cafeterias and things like that. They have over and over and over again over the years, they've made a promise to treat animals better in their supply chain, and then they failed to keep that promise. And it's a pattern that we saw when doing the scorecard. Make a promise, break the promise. That's not to say that they haven't made any progress. They are making progress. A great amount of their eggs are cage-free right now, for example, but they haven't met any of their deadlines, and they've pushed their deadlines back over and over again. And so, yeah, that's just one example where there's a little bit of a divide between the actual act of making the promise and then keeping it.
Yeah, it seems like just a basic measure of, like some companies, I suspect, probably just want the marketing bump that they get from making an announcement like this, and they don't actually want to do the work that's involved in keeping it.
Well, I think, that we're all people, and nobody wants the animals to suffer. And, there's nobody that I've ever worked with at a company, I don't think, not that I know of, not that I would think, that wakes up in the morning and thinks like, yeah, how can I be more cruel to animals?
Right.
Today? I really want to screw over egg-laying chickens today. How can I do that? Everybody, I think, goes into it with good intentions, whether they want a marketing bump or they think, I can make a difference in the lives of animals, and it is my responsibility to do that. Is probably different for everybody. But I think that companies, when they make their promises, they're well-intentioned, and things just have a way of either falling by the wayside or just not coming to fruition the way that they want them to.
Interesting. Yeah. If you had to sort of if you were imagining, if we're still producing a report like this in 10 years from now or 20 years from now, how would you imagine that your sort of grading system for what would have to constitute a really high grade would shift?
Oh my gosh, that is a great question. So I mentioned that right now our standard is, I hate to say it, but it's relatively low. Get animals out of cages, get animals out of crates, let them turn around. That's a pretty meager standard of existence, just to say we're going to grade you on whether you're letting animals turn around or not. 10 years from now, 20 years from now, I imagine we are still going to be doing this, and I imagine and I hope the standard will be much higher. What the standards are at that point, what the baseline standards are, I think will be to be determined. But certainly the expectation is that all animals will be out of cages by then, will be out of crates by then, and we'll be looking toward even better standards to give them. Because the reality is that animal welfare, like all social issues, is dynamic. It changes as science changes, as consumer sentiment changes, and what's good practice, one decade might not be the next decade. Good definition of animal welfare used to be give them food and water and keep them alive.
Right.
And that means they're living a good life. We now know that isn't true. Animals need to be engaged in their environment. They need to have basic standards met, like the ability to live a life, that has minimal stress, where they can engage in their natural behaviors. So it changes all the time.
And what's great, Matt, is that your team is not only just putting out the report and saying, here's the work that we did, that we're letting people know what they're doing. You're taking it a step further, and you're working with these companies, using this as a baseline to help persuade them to even do better. Have you been finding success with that approach, going from company to company and showing them what they can do?
Yeah, we've been finding a lot of success. And I think part of the reason is, many companies made their animal welfare commitments 5 years ago, maybe more. And in the years that have followed since they made their promise and today, there's been a lot of turnover at companies. People have retired. People have left and gone to work for other companies. Some people have passed away, unfortunately. These are people who maybe were champions of their animal welfare promises 5 years ago and are now no longer at the company. And so one area where the scorecard has proven tremendously helpful is to get the new folks at these companies that have made these commitments just aware of the history and aware of what the policies are and when they were made and what the intention was, and get them thinking about how they can now move into the implementation phase of their promises. And so it's been really helpful as basically an educational tool for the people who are working at these companies.
So if you were to tell like this, just sort of Joe Schmo, how to make use of this particular report, like how is the sort of average consumer able to use this report in making their own decisions about what to buy and where to buy?
Yeah, I think that the average consumer can read the report, and it's anybody who wants to see it, it's just at humanesociety.org/scorecard. Read through the report, look at the companies that you frequent, whether it's a fast food chain or a grocery chain. If you're in a university or you have a corporate cafeteria, look for your food service management company on there. Click their name in the report. You're going to be taken to a one-page analysis showing their history on animal welfare and the progress they're making, and check it out. And if you want, let it guide your buying decisions.
Would you also suggest that, if people look in and find that they have a company that they like, but that they see has made a commitment they're not fully keeping, to reach out to their corporate offices and say, hey, what's going on there? Why haven't you sort of followed this?
I have definitely heard from some people that have read the report that they've done that. I've heard that people have asked managers at restaurants about it. I've heard that people have called corporate headquarters of the various companies to inquire about it and say, hey, I heard from somebody who called and said, hey, I saw you got an A on the Humane Society scorecard. I just wanted to congratulate you. I've heard from other people who've called and said, hey, saw you got an F on the scorecard. What's going on? What's up with that? And I think that the more people are engaged generally in that way with companies, with food companies, the better off animals will be. Because at the end of the day, companies are there to serve their customers, and they want to know and need to know if their customers care about animal welfare and the issues that are meaningful to them.
So, and Matt, the other arm of the survey that you had mentioned a little bit towards the top of the episode was this larger companies seeming to be investing more in the plant-based companies, that route that they're transitioning towards. I remember Carrie and I, the first few episodes, we were talking about all these different companies that are going wild with all these plant-based alternatives. And so are these companies seeing what they had hoped for in their investments? It seems like things are going really well for them if they're trying to invest in more good, in more plant-based options here.
Well, return on investment is generally not information that we would be privy to, but I have to think that companies that are investing in the plant-based sector are really reaping the benefits. I think that for a few reasons. One, because the sector is just exploding.
Yeah, everyone's doing it. That's clearly a message out there.
Yeah, everybody's doing it. People are buying more plant-based foods than ever before. I read that in the first few months of COVID, sales of tofu skyrocketed by 86%
Wow.
because people were just, looking to, I don't know, cook differently than they usually are because they're confined at home with more time on their hands, or they're looking to eat a little bit healthier since they're not getting out and exercising as much. Whatever the case may be. But plant-based foods have never been more widely consumed. And I think companies that are investing in that space are probably doing very well. They certainly seem to be doing more of it. Nestle, for example, Nestle is the world's largest food company of any kind. And, they're buying up plant-based brands left and right. They bought Sweet Earth Foods, which is a brand of plant-based proteins. Unilever that we mentioned earlier is doing this. They launched a vegan plant-based line of Hellmann's mayonnaise, a plant-based line of Ben & Jerry's ice creams. It just seems like every major food company that there is going full force in that direction.
It's wonderful. Matt, was there anything else that we wanted to touch on in the episode regarding the scorecard?
Well, I want to thank the listeners to the podcast, I guess, because it's people like the everyday consumer who are making a really big difference. The more people buy products that are aligned with their values, the more companies listen, because you're voting with your wallet. Mm-hmm. And the more people who are buying plant-based foods and are avoiding products from the worst factory farming systems, that makes a difference. And I imagine that a lot of those people are the listeners of this podcast. And so I just want to say thanks to everybody out there for voting with your wallet.
That's
wonderful.
Great.
Yeah, that's awesome. Matt, thank you so much. Matt Prescott, Senior Director of Food and Agriculture at the Humane Society of the United States. Thank you so much for joining us. That's all we have for today's show. To find out more about how to keep major companies accountable for the animal welfare promises they make, you know where to find us, humanesociety.org. And Matt actually mentioned humanesociety.org/scorecard to find out, click on that report and find an easy way to find those companies yourself. Thank you so much, and see you next time on Humane Voices.